Have you ever seen a flower so beautiful you wanted to draw it as realistically as possible to transfer its beauty on paper? Then I saw this gorgeous flower blooming in the garden. I've decided it would be such a waste not to at least give it a try. So all you need at this stage is a simple pencil, and you can actually use any color, because later we will layer oil pastels on top of it, which will fully cover the pencil. So this pencil blueprint will serve mostly as a main indicator of the shape of our flower, as well as the general proportions and angles of petals. The best practice to create an accurate blueprint is to start from general to specific. That's why we began with the most general shape of the flower, and by looking closely at all the angles and lines of the flower, we are recreating this shape onto the paper as accurately as possible. And after that, we are dividing the general shape into more specific segments, the petals and the center of the flower. We are not trying to create the perfect copy of the flower with all the details right away. Instead, we are building a simple blueprint that will help us on the next stages of the drawing. So don't pressure yourself to make it 100% perfect and accurate right away. Now that we have created a pencil blueprint of our flower, we can now start on adding. So we start with the base layer of red-violet oil pastel. Basically, we cover almost the whole flower with this base layer. As we do so, we are using medium pressure. Here we want just enough pigment to block in the color and blend it later, but not too much, because we will add more layers of oil pastel later on top of it. We also make sure to leave the center of the flower untouched, since this is the area where we are going to layer yellow oil pastel and darker pink oil pastel, where the darkest parts of petals are. Once we finish layering the base layer of red-violet, we blend it. I'm doing it with my finger. I still tend to think that this is one of the best ways to blend the oil pastels, even though it's a bit messy and you have to make sure you clean the pigment off from your fingers, not to messy up the colors. If that's just not for you, you can always experiment by blending your oil pastels using cotton swabs, napkins, or even blending tips. Now it's time to add the darker shades to our flower. And we start by deep rose magenta oil pastel. So we are going to layer it in the darker areas of petals and in the areas where those petals are overlapping. Same as we did it with the base layers of red-violet oil pastel, now we are using medium pressure as we layer magenta oil pastel too. Our task here is to define the shadow area of the flower, and later we will blend in more pigment to make the transition more smooth and add more movement to the flower too. After we have defined the areas where our petals are overlaying, we can proceed by using the darker shades of rose to block in the darker central area of the flower. In my case, I will be using red-violet oil pastel for this area. we are going to layer the yellow center part of the flower later, we still leave this part untouched. So first we layer red-violet oil pastel, starting from the center where it will border with yellow. We start by using more pressure as we layer red-violet pastel, and then we blend it to the sides of the flower, blending oil pastel together to get this gradient of the color that we see in the flower. As we go on adding the darker areas to the flower, we can also darken the petals in the area they overlap once again, and the central part of the flower is the darkest one, and it has the color close to violet, so we can layer more darker pigment to this area. I will be using violet oil pastel for that, and I blend it with underneath layers. The blending of oil pastels is crucial for us in this drawing for creating this elegant gradation of color and to achieve this movement that we see in the flower in its petals. Now we can finally block in the yellow center of the flower. And I'm using my lemon yellow oil pastel and a bit of green to add to the flower. And so now the main base is pretty much finished, and we can add the final touch of color to the petals and more texture to it. At this stage of the drawing, we look closely at our drawing and at the flower reference to see what our drawing lacks, what to add or to modify, where it needs more details, etc. First, I wanted to darken the center of the flower even more with blue-violet oil pastel. Since the petals still appear to be a bit blank, I think we should also layer here some red-violet oil pastel in the shadow areas of the flower. As we add another layer, we try not to cover the underneath layer of oil pastels, we just want them to blend slightly together. By doing so, not only we will exaggerate the darker areas of the flower, but we will also add more texture and natural flow to it. Finally, we can now add more finishing highlights to our drawing by using red-violet oil pastel and even a touch of white in some of the lightest areas of the flower. By doing so, we will create more contrast and more flow of light in our drawing, which will help us achieve that realistic effect that we strive for. Now it's a good time to add more texture and finishing lines to our flower, those veins that we see on our petals. Notice how those marks that we add to the petals seem to radiate out from the flower. And just like that, one final touch of oil pastel after another, our realistic drawing of the flower comes to an end. I hope you like the result. Our flower looks natural and radiant. It's not too static, there is the movement in petals. The proportions of the flower are accurate but not too perfect, which also adds a certain flow and elegance to our final drawing.